My name is Elisa Iturbe. I'm an assistant professor here at the Cooper Union, and I'm very happy to welcome everyone to the next lecture in our series titled Architectures of Transition. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this lecture series is dedicated to thinking through architecture's role in broad civilizational transition. Now, the immediate impetus for that, of course, is for thinking about energy transition, which is a very urgent topic, as we know. But also the necessary corollary of that is to recognize that energy transition is not just technical. It's rather a question of economic, sociopolitical, and spatial transformation as well. So in that spirit, these talks are meant to bring architects and scholars from various disciplines together so that we can better understand what is needed for the profound changes that need to come about, and also to understand the changes that have happened in the past. So today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Anabel Ford, who is an archaeologist who studies the architecture and the settlement patterns of Maya civilization. And Dr. Ford will be introduced by Elizabeth O'Donnell, who is a professor here at the Cooper Union, former associate dean, and important pillar here of our school. But before I hand it over to Elizabeth, I just want to say that although Maya architecture may seem far removed from the issues of carbon modernity or fossil fuels, I would argue that we still have a lot of work to do in understanding the very nature of carbon form. We're only just beginning to understand its characteristics, its dispositions, etc. And often, because carbon form is all around us, it helps to look at something that is not carbon form to help us see through difference what we are confronting. And in particular, I think pre-modern precedents are really important because they show us that there's nothing inevitable about the way that we currently organize space. And this is especially important at a moment when we feel like so much about the world seems unchangeable and extremely daunting. So looking at settlement patterns that are guided by a totally different set of priorities, I think is very useful, even if we can't necessarily replicate those same priorities today. So it's not necessarily about looking back in order to say, okay, we have to do this today, but to actually just understand that there's nothing inevitable about our systems now. The way that we organize space doesn't need to be exactly as we have it. And for me, in my very limited knowledge of the Maya, I've found a lot of inspiration in the fact that their settlement patterns have a way of integrating domesticity and production and the kind of integrated landscape management in a way that really throws into sharp relief how much we take for granted the separation of those things under the paradigm of carbon modernity. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, who will then hand it over to Dr. Ford. And I'm very excited for this lecture today. I think we're going to learn a lot.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Elisa, and good morning to everyone here on the East Coast, or no, good afternoon to everyone here on the East Coast, and good morning, Dr. Ford. Let me bury my phone. And Dr. Ford, thank you for your generosity in accepting our invitation to speak here at the School of Architecture, a place in which the preoccupations, focuses, and the research of the students and faculty perhaps lie what one would think are outside of your own. We deeply appreciate your bringing your work and the work of the Mesoamerican Research Center to the school. In my own brief, but I would say thrilling encounter with your work, I have already found, I have found that much of your own project, how you have framed your work in archaeology and anthropology, really challenge and expand the boundaries and the conventional definitions of your own discipline, something that I think we are trying to do at this moment in time and have done at this school generally. And that project has real significance for the study of architecture and the city as we imagine it today. I think your work challenges us as both scholars and architects to interrogate the very nature of what constitutes culture and what might best demonstrate the creative, intellectual, and social advances of a culture. Is it about the artifacts that we make? Is it about the objects of human production, both large and small, at the scale of the object or the scale of a built city that we leave behind? Or is it something less tangible, but in some ways so much more resilient, the nature of the very systems of relationship that we establish and practice between society and an external environment. I can't call it a natural environment, because I think the other thing we learn is that those environments that we imagine to be natural in many parts of the world have been carefully stewarded and managed by cultures and people. But it is, we know, a complex web of living, resilient interdependencies that predate human settlements and certainly predate our expansion around the globe. So, a thrilling body of work and a fantastic imagination of an approach to a discipline. So Dr. Anabel Ford is the director of the Mesoamerican Research Center at the University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as the president of the nonprofit organization Exploring Solutions Past, ESP Maya. She is a distinguished Maya archaeologist whose research and publications have helped to decode the ancient Maya landscape. Her encounter of the ancient Maya city of Pilar on the contemporary divide of Belize and Guatemala led to her development of a new conservation strategy, which has been called Archaeology Under the Canopy. It's her passion for the common people of the ancient and contemporary Maya, together with the international politics, conservation, and interdisciplinary research opportunities of today that have inspired the vision of Archaeology Under the Canopy, a style of conservation that engages the present community in the conservation of the forest ecosystem for the protection of monuments and the strategic exposure of ancient structures. The forest itself serves as protection for the monuments and the architects created by ancient city residents, and treats the forest, while a living entity, as a piece of Maya civilization. Dr. Ford received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD in anthropology, archaeology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and has been spending time in the field and doing laboratory work since the 1970s and continues to work till the present. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ford to our school and to thank you once again for your generosity and eagerness to speak to our community. Dr. Ford.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's interesting, I would have put more, I was sort of felt that the assignment was to tell you more about the architecture itself. So that's what I'll be talking about. But my research really looks at that landscape, and it really is something that is very important, that the Maya decision-making had everything to do with provisioning both their food and their shelter. So we'll be focusing on shelter, but of course, and in fact, I might mention that that's not something that Maya archaeologists actually look at. They think that they cleared all the forest for feeding themselves, but they had to have a roof and they had to have poles and thatch, whatever, so in fact, talking about their building is pretty important, because that is certainly, when you look at the sustainable development goals, carbon or no, shelter and food are the main components. So I'm going to focus on shelter, and I haven't really, in my research, I haven't really, I should say, I haven't really included that in how the Maya sustain their system, but it's a real corollary with how they manage the forest for their annuals, is the management of the perennials, which of course are a good portion of their needs for shelter. Let's see if I can't get this to go here. So let's see, just to give you a sense, these people who we call the people of the New World and the Maya, they arrived before 12,000 years ago, and it's really important to understand how they expanded and adapted using the skills of stone and fire. So it's not something, it's something that grew apart from the old world strategies, which actually engaged with animals and other kinds of features that required, plows or wheels or whatever. Those things were not a part of the, oh dear, it's going on its own. We're not a part of its, of lifestyles for the entire Americas. So they were really based on their skill and knowledge of the landscape locally.
Dr. Ford, we're
yeah.
not seeing your screen. Are you sharing?
You're not seeing the screen. Oh, maybe I didn't share.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. So let's see. Yeah, I'm talking to it, but I guess that's it. Thank you. With all the other things. Okay, so let me start again quickly here. Sorry about that. So this is this is the problem of getting started here. Sorry. Okay, so this is the area. And again, I want to emphasize that the people who came into the New World from the Siberian zone during, prior to 12,000 years ago, this is a cold time also, but they expanded and adapted using skills of stone and fire. So it's really important to understand how they developed their knowledge of the landscape in the absence of old world designs. And you could say that we always think, oh, they lacked wheel, they lacked the plow, but actually they lacked the need to maintain those. So this is the prehistory that I'm working with. It's a 2,000-year prehistory, more or less, and the period that I'm going to focus on really largely today is the late classic. It's the last thing that would have been left by the Maya. And when I'm a professional mapper of classic Maya architecture, I would like to know more about the post-classic, but that seems to be something that the new people coming along will have to figure out. Let's see. I'm having a little struggle here. There's a lot of myths surrounding the Maya, and since you're architects, I wanted to mention the one thing is that the main centers are so important, and that's been the largest focus of all archaeology. It's only very recently that people have started looking at settlement patterns, and I don't know what this is doing, so you'll just have to put up with this. Settlement patterns, and there were at least, I'll say, 3 individuals that looked at settlement patterns before I started my projects, but until LiDAR came out, almost no one was looking at settlement patterns. Now it's a crowded field of people who think they know, but actually don't spend time on the forest floor. This picture, the first one is a camera obscura drawn by Catherwood in the 1830s. And then the last one's just a picture to say how people are looking at it today. And, I don't know about you guys, but I think gravity is not just a good idea, it's the law. Things don't come up, they all break down. So, where is the truth here? And, did really Kukulkan and the feathered serpent come out on the equinox or not? I just raised that as a question. Is it a fiction of like Morley and building a equivalent of a Disneyland out of Maya architecture, or is it the truth? Anyway, the panorama here looking at Tikal, this is more like the things that we encounter in this region. And I will start looking a little more closely. The earliest maps are mapped with a plane table alidade. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but I grew up learning about the plane table alidade and working with it. It's a very precise instrument, and you draw as you are in the location. So you can see if you have errors, you're drawing right on the plane table as you're doing your mapping. And it's a very effective way to map. It's of course quite intensive. And this map took over 4 years to create. And here is an example of the central area of Tikal. I'll be focusing a little bit on the architecture of Temple 1 here, Temple 2. Here's Temple 1 and 2 and the North Acropolis, because they're examples of where they spent a great deal of time. And this is a really good map. You will not get better maps from LiDAR than the plane table alidade. But the LiDAR, you spend whatever you spend, the $500,000, and then they can do the whole thing in a day. And you can use your GIS to create your digital elevation model and get your 1 meter contours. But this is a really impressive map, and it's more accurate than your what my geography colleagues call a recreational GPS, but the GPS you might use just handheld in the field. This is what it looks like. You can fly over it today, still quite a lot of forest, and yet you can see the architecture that's been exposed. It's certainly not, a lot of it's still under the canopy, but the ones that are protruding certainly aren't. So here's the a view toward the North Acropolis, it says here, we'll see. So this is a close-up, and this is Temple 1 and 2 and Acropolis. Let's see what happens. Yeah, so this one's going north. This is the North Acropolis envisioned. I also want you to look like all around this area is forest, yet the Maya archaeologists say they denuded it. This would have been a late classic scene. So lots of people in the plaza and coming up the causeway, but all forest all around. I guess it looks prettier from the architectural view. Here's again looking at Temple 1 and 2 across this is a down here. Let's see, down here is a ball court. So this view will have the ball court. Again, it's quite amazing, you know, manicured lawns and forest around. This one doesn't have as many people around, I guess. So here's a view of that North Acropolis and the Temple 2. I don't know if you can see Temple 1, the edge of Temple 1 is there, but you're looking at the North Acropolis and the Great Plaza, Temple 2, the main focus of monumental architecture at Tikal. Here is a cross section. After they took down this, in the argument, and I guess it's not too bad an argument, they removed this one temple in the central Acropolis, which is called Temple 33 or Structure 33, to create, in part, to create this profile excavation. But what they really needed, they needed materials to backfill a big hole that they created. And so when they disassembled Temple 33, they never reassembled it. They completely took it apart. But because of that, we really know a lot about the construction of monuments like that one that's 33. Let's see. So I give you a little sequence here drawn by Tanya Proskuriakov, a wonderful architectural artist of the Carnegie period, also looking at, in this case, the Washoe work was done in the 30s. So she recreated this. Again, you know, it's just looking at the architecture, not at the landscape. So this is an earlier, it goes earlier to late. So you can see that the construction builds over and up and bigger, but not, you know, it's not creating lots of room. It's just making a bigger impression. Everything just moves bigger and bigger and bigger. The main pieces are still there, but it's exaggerated over time. This one has a few palaces, so there is some interior space, but the platforms itself are much bigger than the interior space. Doorways are kind of important, so I wanted to mention that since you're architects. They use lentils, and this is also, the lentils would have been, for the most part, there are a few examples like at Yaxchilan, they have lentils that are carved monuments, in fact, removed and taken to places like the British Museum. I was there one time and I quite forgot they only have 1 or 2 American section exhibits, and I walked in and there was one of the Yaxchilan lentils, and I got close to it and looked. I was looking so close to make sure that it was really the real lentil, and I put off an alarm. But anyway, most of them in all of Tikal and all the central Petén areas, they are lentils that are wood. And this is Chico Zapote, is very, very heavy and good wood. This one's from a lentil in Temple 3, and I actually saw this still in situ. It's now available to see in the museum at Tikal. But you can tell if the wood itself was not very supportive, how collapse would happen. And when you're looking at ancient, what they're called palaces with rooms, you can actually count the rooms simply by where the lintels gave way, and it looks like a little saddle. So when you're in the forest, you can actually identify these rooms very easily because of the falling down of the lintels. This is a small, the view here actually is of an elite house that I excavated, but I use it here because it's really very important that to appreciate, and I only appreciate it from other people who have told me and have worked, like especially at Tikal, when they built stone structures, they built kind of a slab. I don't know whether it's, whether it's a foundation or it's not a necessary part of the structure, but they built a slab, and it actually creates this, I don't know if you can see in this molding right here.
Mhm.
Is actually that slab. It's not a molding at all. I mean, would draw it as a molding, but as I worked with some friends of mine who had worked at Tikal, they showed me this, and in other contexts where you can tell whether you have, where the original building was meant to be, because this building has 3 files of rooms that did have a corbel arch, and it's not this cross section is not of it, but it just is 3 files. I'll go back to here in a moment. But what's interesting is that we had an argument about whether the last file of rooms was a full file or if it was a U shape. And I originally mapped it, or plotted it from the excavations as a U shape. And Rudy Larios spent a good deal of time with me, and we did some excavations, really detailed trenches on the backside of this building. And he showed me that it wasn't that case, and they actually had disassembled the back area. Probably it was collapsing. And we think built this front patio that's in front of this building because they were still wanting to be important. This is a fancy house site. But the fact is he showed me where how the molding, and if the area I was describing as U was really an interior space, it would have that molding, and it did not have it. And then he was able to show me where the floor, the plaster floor, was actually falling down in the back. It was a real interesting experience, because really, if you don't really appreciate architecture or the style, you will miss some of the features and aspects, because that became very important in identifying whether entranceways or lack of entranceways in other parts of the major architecture. So this cross section here is of another temple in the very far north, but what I wanted to show again is these moldings. So this was the original building, and it has 2 moldings, and these actually went around. And also this one had a roof comb. It's the only structure that I really see at El Pilar that had a roof comb. And you saw them, I think on, let's see, these are roof combs. These are just to make things bigger, they're not structurally, you can't go in them, and they probably are putting a whole lot of weight on these things. So this is another view of different ways they would be building. Of course, the solid buildings, I don't know if you've ever been or seen some of the buildings at Angkor, but they are also corbelled, but they do not have, they just have this seal right here, and they're rounded on top, where the Maya felt they had to add this detail around. This is completely, whatever the difference between building a structure and architecture, according to Paul Bailey, a vernacular architect that worked with me for a while. He said that architects want the art of the building rather than just, making something functionally a building. So this is something that is the art of the building. Another thing you probably have heard I consider mythic, is that the Maya had to cut down all the trees to slack lime. I'll talk a little more about lime, but I want to mention here that when you are looking at these rubble-filled walls, they are not, they have marl and they have rubble, but they are not filled with like plaster, they're not filled with lime. What they do is they seal these elements with the lime plaster. So, and that is how they use the lime very, very sparingly, I would say. Now, of course, the facade would be stuccoed. So this is the rubble filled, and all those structures I was just showing you would have been rubble filled, but they do have ones that will have the board and batten. And I suspect we see some of these possibly in the residential component, but mostly you see things that are lower walls with thatching that goes with poles and thatching that go up. But still, this is another strategy that's seen, the board and batten. back to thinking about the plane table. So this, as I mentioned, the original map was done with a plane table, and I was lucky these little signatures beside here, you don't have to read them, but you can, the map was compiled by Bob Carr and was originally started by Jim Hazard. So the book that you can order and the maps you can order are called Carr and Hazard 1961, and I happened to be able to meet them and work with them and know them and interview them. It's been very exciting to learn how they were working in the forest in a similar way to mine. They did different things, but today now this whole place has been, they use LiDAR, but if you look at the maps, they're very, very comparable. And, you know, they try to say that you can see more with the LiDAR, but I don't think so. I think their map is extraordinary. And what you can see now in the LiDAR is what, you know, they had in 2017, something different than what it was there in 1960. But overall, the map is superb. And I mean, it just, do you want to spend the time with people or do you want to do the LiDAR? I guess we want to do the LiDAR now. It's easier or something. But the map was still very, very effective. So one of the things to build things of stone and rubble, you have to have stone. And the one thing that we have tons of is limestone. There's no problem with getting limestone. I'd say, you know, scarring the landscape with quarries is an interesting thing. But you can see here, this is a quarry we mapped in at El Pilar. This is a quarry that was reconstituted to get some rocks out. You know, here's some ideas of how it might have been, and this is us preparing some stones for using in the building that I just had shown you, what I call Sunun, the house site. So, I mean, this is a building material that's readily handy. Of course, you do have to quarry, so you do create lines on the landscape. And this is an example at Tikal in this area. This is a giant temple. If any of you have seen, possibly you've heard of Star Wars, the first one has a view that is essentially looking from this building out. And here are just, I don't even know, I think we said that found that there are some 200 quarries in this area. So while probably didn't do the whole thing of Temple 4 here, but it probably was a good contributor to the stone that was required there. Might want to figure out what the landscape might have looked like before those quarries were there. Of course, the material of limestone can be slack to lime, and lime is very important in the stucco and the plaster floors. It's used considerably to the ceiling and very important to the management of sealed spaces, you could say, from the household on out. This has been really seen, you know, the burning of lime for plaster has been seen as a deforestation strategy. And, you know, that somehow the Maya didn't notice that the balance between needing lime for plaster and the forest that they needed for other things. They simply, according to some archaeologists, would just, you know, deforested for plaster. But really, these again are people that really know how to operate in the forest because first of all, coppicing is just a big tradition and things resprout here. In fact, 8,000 years of people living in this forest would make me feel that the entire forest is responsive to cutting and burning. So, you know, I mean, that would be a clear adaptation. I did learn last year we were surveying after COVID, and during COVID there was this terrible fire that did impact El Pilar, and one tree that does not respond well to it can resprout, but it doesn't respond well to fire is allspice, and it's a very important tree for condiments. And interesting that it does not. It absolutely cannot tolerate even a nearby fire, I think. It's very unresponsive. But anyway, most are very responsive, and even people who have worked and lived in the forest for, let's just say people who are in the 70 to 80 year range, they know exactly, like Alfonso Sewell would talk about how his mother would want a particular size tree or wood and a particular kind of wood. And he started, when he was sent out as a boy to get firewood, he would start creating the firewood by coppicing and having the sprouting. And so he could always have the right wood and the right size. So it strikes me that, first of all, the Maya people who live there have a very clear understanding of the potentials of their environment, and they're selecting all the time. Probably one might say there could be some extinctions. Still, it's one of the most biodiverse forests in the world, second to the Amazon. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is that there are many ways to create stucco, especially the kinds of specialized stucco that you might want to use on the walls. And there is a group of people, which I am variously in touch with at UNAM, the main university in Mexico City. And they have a it's called the Centro de Estéticas, or it's Instituto de Estéticas. It sounds like aesthetics, but in fact, they work with all the dimensions of these, how ancient and modern stuccos. There's a project that is recording all of the murals of mural art, pre-Hispanic and colonial. And they argue there are so many ways to make stucco, and the famous murals of Bonampak. They have learned, I mean, I'm going to say that they could make a stucco that was not burning, but it was with some, either something, a tree sap, a tree called, there's one called chaca, and there's also, they use opuntia cactus. And there's ways of making stucco that you don't have to burn, that you treat, somehow chemically treat. You have to be planning. These take years to set up. And it creates a stucco that's like Jello. They said that, and it hardens over a long period of time. And that's why you could get these brilliant colors. They said that the Sistine Chapel wouldn't have been a problem if they had the Mesoamericans with them. So, it goes many different ways. So there's really, I want to mention these floors that I'm showing in this picture is this excavation I did going into a temple we call EP7 or Shikna, and I have a picture of it in a moment. But these floors, and I'm not at the base floor, the earliest floor we have that we date to about 800 before current era is made with about 70% lime. So clearly they were burning lime. The last ones I have, and I don't have a picture of that, but now it makes me think I should have had a picture of it. The last one is a palace that is in the south. It's it's called EP3, and its stucco has no lime. So clearly, over time, they were learning something. They weren't just doing it like this man here, Carmen, was helping us. We did a traditional lime kiln, and this traditional lime kiln will use a lot of wood, but this would have been a household strategy that would be used in the last, 500, I'll say 200 years, 100 years. This is what Carnegie would have recorded, and it's more abusive of wood, but it wouldn't have been the way all stucco would have been made, and it wouldn't have been the kind that would have allowed a sustainability of a growing population and growing architecture. I mean, so they weren't getting rid of, there's much more to it than that. I don't know enough, but I would say that there's a lot more. Okay, here's some profiles. An architect, John Used, helped me early on to create pictures, the plan views and early profiles of just what we were looking at. And this is our main Plaza Copal at El Pilar, which is, about 2 soccer fields long and pretty wide, and these two, this Eastern temple is the one we did we were going to do a trench through, but it turns out that when we hit the first staircase out here, it was so beautiful, we decided we'd go down and then we'd start to go up. But instead we found this we found this very early floor, and we followed it all the way through. This is about 44 meters through. And, you know, we just made up the little bits in between based on what we had, but this is how profile looks. And this starts, the earliest dates are in, you know, almost 1,000 years ago. And the latest dates are around 1,000, I should say 1,000 before the current era. So it's 3,000 years or 2,000 years. We're looking 3,000 years of prehistory and 2,000 years of building here. The last ones are built 1,000 years ago, and the first buildings are 3,000 years. And there's looting. This was a looted thing. This one is another interesting one. Is again, this is very early. This is a little round structure, and you can see it's built very completely differently than this big plaza that came up in the later periods. Well, I'll mention another thing. This, unlike the Tikal example, these buildings are facing east while the final buildings are facing west. So there's a lot of changes going on in this plaza over those 2,000 years. This is a view using the LiDAR and our mapping. We've been mapping here since 2014, looking at settlement patterns. So this is El Pilar. One thing I know that architects sometimes look at are axes of the monuments, and you can see how it changes. But what's even interesting at El Pilar is that this area, the southern area, is very publicly open, where the northern area is very exclusive and closed. So those are different ways that movements are inhibited. And in fact, most of the things are almost in baffles to get into the north, where they're very easy to walk in the south. So I'm going to switch now over to my residential component. Are there any questions? Do we stop or just keep going? Or I'm out of time? Nope, keep going.
No,
Okay.
I think it's great.
Okay, so this is just trying to give you an idea of these patio groups. Some of them can be raised and elevated on patios that are formal, or they can be informal, and then isolated structures beyond. So I'm going to be starting to talk about how the residential setting looks, and maybe, I don't know if it's worth all of the, well, I point out a few things on this map if I can. Let's see. I'm not able to. Here is a big set of quarries right next to the big Acropolis area. There's quarries all over, but also there are these house sites. You can see houses here. All of these little things here are basically houses. So we're looking at a city that is pretty actively occupied in different ways. We have the main architecture of the monuments. We have this unusual offset causeway with a sunken plaza. This looks like a ball court. We have a ball court over here, and we have a ball court over here. So, you know, there's various kinds of public and private sections shown here. So we'll move on. Mapping in the Maya area, and this is, I worked long before there was LiDAR, and the kind of work we're doing now is the same. We're going and validating things we see with LiDAR, but the LiDAR is insufficient. You really have to have boots on the ground. I know that some people think it's a magic wand, but I feel very strongly that my interest in how the landscape is managed really depends on validating, not just that there's something there, which is one part, and I've been very satisfied with how the LiDAR works. The topography is fantastic. I mean, without that, you're going blind. It doesn't mind me. We would do transects and we'd figure it out. But the splotches, you could say, they are evidence, but getting in the field, you really can tell whether it's a structure or a quarry, or if it's a depression. The different kinds of things that are features. We call them house mounds because that's what everyone has called them, montículos in Spanish. And you can see on the right here that James is standing on top of one of these. They do stand out. I mean, it's obscure sometimes, but they do stand out. So just showing you, even in the forest, you can see these things. And these are the platforms or the remains that would have had perishable superstructures, not like the major monuments of El Pilar or Tikal. These would have use wood and other perishable pieces. Again, this is just another set of examples, just to say the kinds of features. Up to now, we've mapped 18 square kilometers, the binational protected area. That, I mean, and I don't know if I mentioned, but I was the one that encountered El Pilar as an archaeological project in 1983. So it wasn't really on any map. So our work and the development of the idea of a protected area between Belize and Guatemala has all been part of my project. And now we're working on the 18 square kilometers. And this is a big project that has a lot of collaborators and interdisciplinary as well. I have master forest gardeners that help me identify trees. I have soil scientists that help me identify properties of the soil that I think have factors into why the Maya settlement patterns are the way they are. I have palynologists, economic botanists, what have you, volcanologists, geologists, geographers. I guess you could name it. I hope I have architects after this. So total features, and these features are not just, as you can see, individual mounds are only half the total features. We're mapping berms and aguadas and depressions and quarries and chiltoons, these storage things. So features are everything, but what we're after are the mounds. And we consider these mounds evidence of domestic architecture, can be defined as residential units. And we have come up with 3 types. Originally, I only had 2, the primary residential unit and the solitary single residential unit, but we've been finding some features we call solitary range structures. These are like palaces, like those ones we were looking at Tikal and even the house site I said. These are big pieces of architecture with no evidence of other kinds of structures around them, at least without excavating. And so they represent something very different. And so we separate them out and don't count them in the population estimates. What archaeologists have traditionally done is take individual mounds as individual houses, something like we have a house, I have a house. So one house is one family and a family is 5 people. So if you had 2,000 individual structures, you'd have 2,000 times 5. But if you actually are only looking at primary residential units, you'd have a very different number. So one of the other kinds of problems and the myths about the Maya is that they overpopulated, but it's what is your proxy for population? And if you have traveled around the Maya area in the early days, you can see how traditional people live, and they lived in compounds. I'll show you some pictures of that. And the compounds minimally have one major main structure and one ancillary structure, which is the kitchen. So we decided that it has to have a minimum of 2 structures to really be considered a primary residential unit, and that would be a way to calculate population. So instead of 2,000, you'd end up with 1,000 in that sort of average. But as you can see, we have 692 instead of 1,000. These you can see down what I call primary residential units. They range from a few that have one, I think, like this one, a single structure on a plaza, we consider primary also, because the investment in the plaza, we may not be seeing the other structures, but so it's really it's not fair to say 1, but it'd be 1 on a plaza. So the equivalent of 2 to 8, the mean is 2.4. So that's really ranging into the higher, almost 3 structures. So you can see that there's a much more complex way of looking at this landscape between what I'm calling primary and solid and secondary. So here's an example of a primary residential unit in the Yucatan. You can see that the house and the interior courtyard of the in this case bounded by a wall. Inside is a garden, open and closed areas, and enough sun here where you can dry your chiles. This is a really nice architectural rendering of a typical Maya house in a vernacular architecture book for the Mexico. And you can see again, these are ancillary structures here. This is an addition. This is the original structure with also the additions. These are trees. And this is what I'd call the forest garden and the little milpa. And this really is an example of how interior spaces are used. There's enough space for some important food things and probably fruit trees, and also a number of different activity areas, open areas, and then wooded areas and orchards and field crops. Beehives could be a nursery for plants. And of course, today, chicken coop and even washing areas. So these things you can imagine in the past as well. This would be a kitchen. You can see the walls are not so formal, but they are there. Just to give you a sense that the ancillary structures might not be as formally developed. A lot of these, like you mentioned, these plazas, they can be elevated. They have different structure outlines, and they can be elevated and developed in different ways. Just showing here, terracing or building that platform. Low walls that get the perishable structure above. So here's some examples. This is in the Yucatan. You can see the apsidal form. That's I thought that was very beautiful. And in fact, I think this structure had at one time didn't have this walled in, and had it at a storage, and then it was walled in and turned into part of the house. What's interesting about this is it turns out that the thatching that they're using require you to have rounded corners. You can't have, if you make it a firm corner, you will compromise the value of the roof, and it will always have troubles at those corners. And I have seen examples where people have built model examples of Maya houses where they've tried to make it more square and they compromise. They have leaks. That's where you'll always have leaks. Just some other examples, things that might, if you're thinking about what we're mapping, this lower right-hand one has a real formal rubble kind of thing that you might see sticking around when you have a collapsed building, and different kinds of treatments of those lower foundations. Here's even one where they built out, I don't know how, it's interesting. I don't know the story behind this, but they're building they had it open at one point apparently, and there you can see the very formal, looks like even cement and plaster floorings that they're building this apse or the end here. All these have these names. I'm trying to learn them. I won't pretend I know all of them. But I do know those rounded things are called moi for whatever reason. So here's more examples of how these, how you can imagine we get house mounds. That's what I really am looking at, the different ways that the thatching, the finishing. In fact, I mentioned that thatching are really important. Here's two examples. In the upper one, it's what we call the guano, or the fan palm or bay leaf palm, and then the lower one are the corozo palms. And in corozo palms, you must make them square. You cannot, you are obliged by the way the roofing material is to create them in a squared way. So where I work, the preference is for the fan palm, but the corozo exists. But in the South, there's no fan palm, so that they will always be using the corozo. Oh, now I want to move to what are interiors, and you can see how there are multiple structures in these interiors. They're compounds. Lots of different things happening. I showed this picture in the lower right to my team, and I said, well, this would get us confused. Is that a structure or those stones? How would we map that, Just different varied wall treatments, different kinds of features that they are collecting or using. It may be that's just a bit for some next construction, or maybe a result of quarrying. These interior spaces, They are for activities that need to be in the inside during the day, and then they will move the hammocks, and it'll be the dormitory in the evening. So it's really a multi-purpose room, but not a kitchen. That's really important. Kitchens use fire, and of course fire is so to control where fires might be, they have the kitchen aside. So now what, not just kitchens, but all kinds of little ancillary buildings will be found for various kinds of purposes. I don't know. I mean, I know that there are kinds of trees that they say are good for tanning. So that might be a kind of thing that they have. But they have beehives are very, very important, especially at the time of contact, which meant before that, the Spanish couldn't get gold out of the Yucatan, but they could get wax and honey, and they were really keen on sugar. So honey was very important, of course, wax for the ecclesiastic affairs of candles and so forth. So it's diminishing the use of the Melaponia, the local bee, although people are trying to resurrect it. But this is how the beehives look. They're really really beautiful, and they're on these scaffoldings, and this is abandoned one in the upper one, and Macduff here, photographer that works with me, found this one. It's beautiful, where they carved the actual bee on the hive. So, and they cap them, like you can see here, with this mud, but sometimes you find it's claimed that you can find little caps, that are things that would have been partly like a ceramic piece or a stone. So this is really important. It says, of course, that they were managing water and always having, it's a perennial, the rainforest has flowering all sorts of different times, so that there were enough pollen for the bees. But that would be, if beekeeping was important, there was management of water and flowers, we'll say. This is a kiln, probably influenced by the Spanish, but probably could have had things like that. And then this other thing is called a sweat bath. So and we know they have sweat baths, so that is another kind of patio use. Out in these peripheral areas, they'll have corn cribs, and they'll have these little seed beds for nurseries. And of course, these look really less formal, less likely we would find them archaeologically, but some of these get more formal with some amount of foundations. And certainly you would think that in ancient Mayan times, when there was a lot larger population in these areas, that they might have been more effort at claiming spaces, we could say, because that's what we see, spaces that are claimed. Also, these secondary residential units would be in their farmsteads farther out, like this little building in a milpa field, in the context of secondary and primary growth or mature growth. This last section, if I'm still doing okay with you guys?
Absolutely.
Okay, so now in the past 2 years, I've become very interested in how to build a house and what the natural resource costs of building would be. And talking with traditional, people who built these things, many are older than I am, and they're not building these things anymore. And thatching is becoming so expensive because of the tourist industry. They're not using thatch anymore. And of course, we now have new materials. We have wire and hammers and nails and whatever, things that did not exist in prehistory, and in that matter was not used until the last 30 years, I would say. So my early days of traveling, everything was made in this very traditional way, and things were very available. When I was first working in the area where I am in Belize, people lived in pole and thatch buildings, which I don't even know if I see one now. But I'm learning about the different names of things and what they mean, and what you need, because construction, if you say that I go and I identify the trees at El Pilar, and I can say, okay, well, this one's for construction, this is for fruit, this has oil, whatever. But construction doesn't tell you what it can be used for. You can't use just anything to put in the ground, for example. It has to have what they call the heartwood is chulul. And you know, like I have a house where I have planted a lot of trees, and I planted a mahogany tree, and it's now 15 or 18 years old, and it's rather large. And when it was like 10 years old, I said, oh, well, that would make good posts. They laughed at me. You would never put a mahogany in the ground. It would just disintegrate. So that's just not something you would use for mahogany. Though mahogany is a dominant tree in the Maya forest, you have to have heartwood. And this has been an exciting project, but I'm only, I say, partway there. And this year I'm going to I have a French geospatial engineer that's going to be working on, you know, what would we say? I don't know, if we per 10 square meters. I'm not sure how we'll do it, but we'll try to figure out what a average cost per meter, square meter is for building a house. And maybe we'll do a minimum size house, because they seem to have that view, and maybe we have that in the, I'll have to look at what our sizes are. But I want to reconstruct it. And first, there's all kinds of stories about this, but these are all the parts. The only one I can really mention right now is this Bel Cho. And I can't remember whether Cho is mouse or rat, but they don't differentiate. So I had two names. I said, which one's right? Oh, they're the same. What means mouse track, you know, where they run. And so the name of that particular member, which looks like a rafter of some kind, is the mouse road, which is just interesting to think. I think they all have some kind of, like Noch means big. I know that. Not a Maya. I now am regretting I didn't learn Mayan. But you can see all these parts, when you talk to them, they say they never went more than like half an hour away to get all the parts they needed to walk. And this is contemporary people I'm talking about to today. And of course, all of this was done with vines and so forth. Just a minute. Just go through here.
Sorry. Okay. We're all in school. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's in person. Can you imagine? Yeah. Okay, so just getting an idea that so vines, it turns out vines are really important. And these are the main pieces that put things together. And I don't know if you've tied a bow around a package or so, but you need a certain length to actually accomplish your goal, if you think about it. And I knew that from some of the days that it was you had to have tall trees because of the vines. The vines would grow long. Well, that made sense, you know, that made sense. So if you have a house, you need to have posts that have the heartwood, and you need vines that are long enough to bind. Now you can double, you can splice in, but you have to have a certain amount. And I'm trying to remember, I have my notes here. I didn't go back to them, but there has to be a certain minimum length that they are. So it's just really interesting to me to think that you can't, if you burned a field, you won't have vines. Right. So if you think of the whole area is agriculture, you won't have vines. You won't be able to build this is a rainforest. I don't know, it might rain. Right. Okay, then this is how they put it together with the palms and the components. So we have a lot of information. It's all in Spanish. It's really, really a beautiful, this text is relatively recent, but really nice. And how everything's done. The other part that's still I quite don't understand how you finish the roof, because now the roofs are usually they put a corrugated iron over because that's easy. But how they did this is they wove back and forth that same fan palm in a particular way that tightens it. It's still I'm still learning how to do that roof ridge. That's a very important skill, and it turns out skill. Everyone knows, basically what posts you're supposed to use, or what kinds of things are more flexible for the roof and so forth. But there are certain people in the community that will be specialists, and they will do the specialized things. They will even, when people bring in the thatch, they will sort the thatch between acceptable and not acceptable. And so in the community, there'll be people that are more skilled and do the finer, contribute that. I don't know, I don't get the feeling they're paid. I get the feeling that they're part of the family, but I haven't investigated that part. I'm just more interested in the skill. My family are from Ireland, and in fact, my Irish family there, they talked about how even though they could butcher, that when they had to kill a cow or whatever they killed, they would call in their neighbor who was a specialist and really knew how to do it better. So you can think about the community having specialities, and I think building is a very important component. Anyone seems to can be able to build a kitchen. I got that factor, but not a home. And these homes would be, they said, 24 by 15 feet. So they were talking in feet. So, another important thing is life expectancy. The fan palm is expected to be at least 20 years, where that the pinnate palm, the corozo, really isn't expected to be survive more than 10 years. So there's also that kind of factor, and it's all based on, even there's other factors, how close you bind them, how whatever. These houses are perfect in the tropics, though. They're cool inside. The situation now is building with concrete and iron is not a good idea. Anyway, I think now I'm coming maybe towards the end, just how do we honor these monuments and how El Pilar can be a living museum in this Maya forest. And I also want to mention, we call them monuments, not ruins, because who would want to go see a ruin? Come and see the ruin of my house or whatever. You'd want to see something that is really remarkable. So I'm sad that they've been called ruins. So it's my community around 20 years ago, we did a little mobile workshop to a lot of these monuments. We were at Tikal, and they said, why do they call them ruins? I looked it up in the dictionary, and it says everything destroyed. So I've decided that I will honor and respect them. And also I feel that we really need to reevaluate how we present them. And that's why I've talked about this archaeology under the canopy. If this forest is as important biodiversity, why are we clearing it to see monuments? We can see them in this way, framed, or another way, framed, that really creating a new aesthetic, harking back perhaps romantically to Catherwood. But Catherwood didn't know anything about the trees. He did good presentations of the monuments, but he really didn't know anything about the trees. So we would like people to learn about the fact that these were trees that the Maya lived with for 8,000 years. And what we're looking at is whatever they sustained and allowed to sustain. So this is just an important project, I feel, not just looking at Maya landscape, but also looking at how the community participates and how we can invite this place, which is binational, to be an example of a peace park of nature and culture. So I don't know, I think that might be the last. This is it. So this is the Maya forest at El Pilar. We're looking to Pilar Poniente. We're looking west to towards Tikal from one of the highest points at El Pilar, and we're still working there. So come on down and visit.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'll stop here.
Yeah, okay, great. We're stop sharing. Okay, so I'll ask some questions and get a dialogue started. We'll definitely be opening up to folks who have joined us for the talk and the conversation. So I guess I had two thoughts, but I feel that through your talk, this notion of the practice of deforestation or not deforestation for various parts of meeting the needs of a society, of creating shelter. And certainly in your book, you talk about it as an act of agriculture, that in the European understanding of agriculture, the first step is to cut down the forest. So there's a removal of the forest in order to make the soil or the land hospitable to the plow, basically, and that and that the notion of the plow and pasture become the dominant orientations of the practice. It's like a whole orientation to how one thinks about the ecosystem and what I guess at the time were thought of as the competing needs of society for food. And your work on the forest garden, I think is such an opposite orientation to that, where the health of the forest is integral to meeting the needs of people for food. Then I think the story becomes even more complicated with the notion of plaster and lime. So was the forest similarly under threat because of the needs for building? And I guess then finally, but that might be a different question. It might be a different question about the notion of architecture, which kind of at its very basis thinks of itself as a practice of shelter, or we think of the identity of architecture as something that shelters. Well, then the question is, sheltered from what? So, it sort of sets up an antagonistic relationship to the environment that humanity finds, be it forest or open grassland. So could you maybe stitch together a little more about your research on the forest garden and, this incredible research and description of how certain parts of the building practice are drawn from the forest, the vines, the thatch, but potentially there's also a friction between stone and lime and plaster and the forest.
Well, don't you think that? I think that's for everything, let's see if I can, I have a GIF that sort of addresses this. If I can find one here, I just like to show it because that opposition becomes something different if you oh dear, I'm gonna have to screen again.
No problem. No problem. Yep.
Find the right share here. I sometimes hit the wrong button. Let's see. Is this one I want?
The share's coming through. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna have this show. I think, of course, you're right, and I like the idea. I mean, is it competition? It's both. You have to have a tree to build, you have to have food to eat, you have to have shelter, you have to have space, whatever. Oh, I got the wrong one. This is a nice one, but that's not the one I want. I want the one, if you can wait again, I don't know. Let's see if I find the one. I want the one that is the Milpa cycle. Let's see.
Yes. Yeah, the 20-year cycle.
Yeah, because what we have now is we've worked at have to give me a chance to look it up, because we have basically 80% of the I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can't find something right here, but 80% of the landscape at any one time is not in annuals, and so at any one time, and it's asynchronous. If I can find my little guy, it will be a very big help because it's really a good example. But let's see, you have the building and food. So but you have to resolve those things, and it's not Malthusian, it turns out to be it makes me mad that I didn't think about that. It seems like all your questions were more like that, about the research, the Milpa cycle. But I surely have something on it somewhere. Oh, yeah. Well, oh wait, I think I did see it. Oh dear. I'm sorry to to cause this problem.
I mean, it's all fine, and we can sort of chat around it as well, if that's easier. You know, I can.
Here it is. I have it. So it just because it really is a neat little example. And I'm not on share though. It's very complicated here. Sorry about this. I will now share the Milpa cycle, because it really bears on how all those things can be resolved. And I mean, I don't want to think that these guys are like so in tune. I mean, people want to say harmony. I don't think it's harmony. I think that they, you know, we're talking about thousands of years of living in the forest. And so here, everything that is yellow is the field, light green is succession, and darker green is mature, and that's in a sea of forest, which is not applicable here. Everything that's in this Milpa cycle view animation is less than 14 or 15% slope, which we feel that that slope is a real important factor in controlling erosion, so that people are less likely to clear. And also they will need, I mean, that picture of the lintel I showed you, that is a very large tree. So they are using large trees in these carved lintels. So wood plays a role more than just in the smaller things. But I think in large part, they don't need big trees, which is an interesting comment. They're not going out, they're not doing cordwood, you know, cutting down and cordwood. They're doing a lot of selection, coppicing and poldering and all those other kinds of ways you manage trees. Because you can cut at a top and still have a good section of thick tree, you know, so you have to be more thoughtful about how the Maya might use these landscapes, and know that they worked with stone and fire. You know, how would they get a big tree? They probably, you know, girdled it. I mean, the plazas are plastered. They didn't have trees growing in there, though I always wonder, maybe they had some kind of smaller trees, because shade has to be a real important factor. So largely these like the slope I didn't mention, but in Plaza Copal, the slope of the Copal that we see when we're going there is flowing north, is slanting to drain north. But the floor that we have, that very early floor, slants to drain east. So they were very concerned about where water was going, and all those areas are areas also where they head towards collection areas where they're collecting water. We didn't talk a little about water, but it's interesting to think about food versus other things. And I think people have not, for looking at the Maya, have not thought of those other things. But we had to, in my work, if you read my book, I was so focused on how they would resolve the food side. Can we get a population and food being matched? That was my main concern early on. So now that I see that we can resolve food as long as you have a population that's a reasonable population. And when we look at pre-industrial agrarian societies, really having more than 100 people per square kilometer is really rare. So I think my archaeologists who are coming up with numbers that are 1,000 or more people per square kilometer, I say it's either meals for millions or it's wrong. You know, it's just, I mean, Benin, Bangladesh, those are not examples. And those are modern, you know, where we have getting average populations over the large haul. So when you put a population that is reasonable, and you look at how the landscape had to provide both food and shelter, you get, I mean, I suspect we could note, we're going to do the same thing at Tikal, and I think we'll see more of that tension you're talking about between trying to resolve things that need wood and trying to resolve things that need annuals. So annuals versus perennials. But they're going to be very conscious of this, because this evolves over thousands of years. So they're going to know they need to have vines to bind. They know they need hardwood. So maybe they don't need them so big, but at a certain point, they're going to be compromising things if they go too small. They won't have something that endures. That, like these walls, the walls of the small palace at the house site are barely, I think they're just a little more than a meter, where you never see them less than 1.5 meters in the monuments. So they're obviously compromising building the corbel when they
Mhm.
reduce the size of the wall. So you can imagine that. What else did you ask me? I mean, and pasture and plow, everyone looks for arable land. I love mentioning this because arable means plowable. So
Right.
you're no arable land in the Maya area or any of the Americas, no arable land. So you have to think of that knowledge of the landscape and the skills that they had, because that's where they focused. They had to focus. There's that book called Tending the Wild for, and I don't like using wild because I think it was a cropscape. This was a cropscape, and I think you can really see it as a cropscape where every part of it was managed. The dominant trees of the Maya forest are 20 dominant trees of the Maya forest, and they are all useful. So I feel that they're selecting, based on their needs. And, I mean, for example, the corozo, you can't burn it, and the only way you can get it to die is to eat its heart, and it's good. So they would eat its heart, but there'd be certain plants that you couldn't eliminate. So you'd have to build a reason to use. It turns out the corozo palm is useful for oil and for construction and all kinds of things. So, that made a good what do you call it, a subsidy from nature sort of thing.
Hmm. And sort of to pick up on this question about sustainability, resiliency, a landscape versus a cropscape, and impacts on cities, and then also the question of density. It sounds like there is an ongoing debate within your discipline about what was the population of the Maya. And I would imagine it was different at different times, but is there some new consensus on that, recognizing the dependence on this very sort of sophisticated and specific cropscape management of the forests and, and I guess I'm going to use the word agriculture just for the lack of what the broader term is, because I think agriculture imagines that the plow is now in the picture. So have you in your research and study thought about looking in the opposite direction of recognizing what the cropscape pattern was and the cycling between forest and planted annuals? What kind of a population could that have sustained?
Oh yeah. In my book, I come up with a number, like I think it's 180,000 people in 1,300 square kilometers, and that's this big local area. And I think that we have something like, I don't know, 3,000 people. It comes up to be about 120 people per square kilometer at El Pilar, but we're going to be working on that. The way I do it is, well, you can figure it out. Maybe it's less. It's that 692 times 5 would be approximately what I'm coming up with. And these are high numbers when you go look at like pre-industrial China, which was very, it had firepower, it built the wall, it had people out in ocean, 1500 AD, and they had like 65 people per square kilometer. Now, someone asked, I looked at a secondary source for that, Esther Bozra, but I mean, did that include the slaves? I'm assuming she was including everything. And pre-modern Japan has like 120. I mean, these are not numbers that, the numbers that, there's no consensus, I will say, starting out. I think people who are reasonable will start looking at this concept of, and I see my ideas have never been, I'm on a completely different arena. I don't think my ideas in archaeology have taken, root. But when I talk to farmers, the farmers, like I'll ask Narciso Torres or Alfonso Sul. I asked Alfonso Sul to read. I never publish anything about the Milpa cycle that has some details without my collaborators in the field to agree. And I've had arguments, or learn things like about the mahogany. But the last time I wrote something which was called Scrutinizing the Paleoecological Record, you might want to see that. It's like trying to get the paleoecological record, the archaeological record, and the Milpa cycle align, so people can see that those things you could interpret the paleo record not as deforestation, because they throw disturbance into deforestation, and disturbance only means that there's more things that humans have done to the landscape. That's a neutral thing, I think, and largely doesn't say it's deforestation, but they want to have it, black, white. It's either forested or not, and forested is good and not forested is bad. So disturbance is bad. So that's a problem of trying to look at the Milpa cycle. If you look at my little cycling, it's going to be disturbance all the time.
Right.
So that isn't bad if it's controlling erosion, if it's moderating temperature, if it's building biodiversity, if it's fortifying soil, if it's, all those things, feeding people. So, I mean, in my model, if you just invest more time in your Milpa, basically, you would say, you can invest more labor and skill and time in your field to get more product out of the field, so low yields are, let's just say 800. I mean, these fields have 40 different things already planted. They have weeds, they have other things that might be useful, things that pop up as they say a recommendation, but they go from everything a low 800 to a high, the Lacandone, who had no taxes, were completely away from people, have upwards of 2,800 kilograms of maize per hectare. So that that's a labor investment, and it has a bandwidth. You can just spend more time or less time, and there's certain things you have to do at a certain time.
Right. And then the other question I wanted to ask before we turn it over to the audience is, I thought your description of building practices and the relationship between that forest and maintaining a healthy forest and a building was really clear, and it made so much sense. Have you done any research in how there was the development of a particular city form or urban form due to that relationship? So in architecture,
You mean patterns?
I guess I mean patterns, like for one of a pattern, a dense grid, a radial pattern,
these guys, whether you're at El Pilar or in a distant village, they are always focused on well-drained uplands. So I guess the tension will be there. And that's one of the things we can ask, though I haven't been able, I can't speak directly. I have a few things I could say, but the density overall, when I'm looking at very broad, I'm comparing Tikal, El Pilar, the whole area, is that the highest density of settlement will always be in the well-drained uplands. And that will average around 200 structures per square kilometer. But that doesn't mean primary structure. There'll be more primary residential units in those areas as well. As you get into less desire or less well-drained, I will say, because drainage is pretty important in a rainforest, it'll drop to, like 20 or 30 structures per square kilometer, and largely those will be solitary. So there are significant patterns. It's the other thing is that the areas that have large quantity or large zones of well-drained uplands, let's just say Tikal, for example, have the highest numbers overall. So we have the 200 structures per square kilometer, but if you have, let's just say 9 square kilometers of well-drained uplands, well, those will be 200 times 9, where if you only have 4, or if you only have 1, you can see that the numbers will be less. And I'm talking only the late classic the pattern of the final period. You did mention, and we do know that there's less building and more building. I have those data for the classic, the development of the classic. It's less in the earlier periods and more in the late classic, but the patterns are actually still the same. It's infilling in the same pattern that was earlier. And then what else? There was another part of that. But anyway, if you have 9 square kilometers of 200 structures per square kilometer and whatever, I mean, that is a proxy for population. That's
Right.
where the biggest monuments are. And if you go and plot, I mean, my feeling is if we could know how much well-drained uplands are, we could look at it, probably be almost a one-to-one relationship between amount of well-drained uplands in the region and the monumental architecture that's there.
Mhm.
We should
So we have a
open
little
to
bit of-
audience questions now because some of our students will have to get to class soon. So
Okay.
yeah, if we have maybe questions from the audience, you can either raise your hand or put them in the chat. Either way.
Elisa, I'm not good at that. Can you let people speak? Can you see when there are speakers?
Yeah.
Okay,
If you want, I can handle that. I
Great.
don't see anyone raising their hand though, so we may not have an audience question.
Okay.
But I think maybe if we don't, I did have one question, and then maybe that can be our last and we can wrap up. Because we have class at 2 p.m. here. But I was just wondering, it's actually related to Elizabeth's last question about urban form and trying to understand basically how things are distributed spatially. Because I'm very intrigued by the spatial distribution of the various elements of the settlement pattern, as we can see in the drawings and the maps that you showed. And one thing that really jumps out to me is the absence of roads. And my understanding is that there are some causeways between ceremonial centers, but it doesn't seem that they really go out into the residential areas or the milpa areas. So I'm just curious about that kind of aspect of the settlement pattern, how people move through space, how, what is the relationship between the domestic architecture and the ceremonial centers, if anything, like what are the patterns you see there in terms of the relationships between the elements of the city, right? If we were to call this and I've read some things that sort of debate whether you call this a city or not. So I'm also curious about that, but in any case, kind of how does the distribution of elements of the social system, right? The domestic space, the productive landscape, the ceremonial centers, the causeways, kind of how are all those things relating to each other?
Well, at El Pilar, the causeways are very formal, so they're not the informal. And there are places that have more evidence of formal roads of some kind, causeways, but the one I'm thinking of particularly is Caracol, but it's very steep land. There's a lot of, it's a lot of slope in that area. So it may be slope factors make you want to invest in something that is more formal. But at the time of contact, people use trails, they don't have horses, they don't have, and in fact, at the time, 1500, wheels weren't very useful. The only wheels were used in Roman times. And if you didn't maintain the road, those were not worth maintaining. And it's a tump line economy. So they're using trails, and it's great to see read translations of experiences of people crossing the Petén, saying the people, they just materialize out of the forest or they melt into the forest. They don't see the trails. The trails are very well known, and in the areas when I was working in the central Petén at Tikal, everyone knew the trails. So I'm not sure. That's a pretty low level use, but I think that those trails are very prominent. I'm thinking another example is people would run to a party. Now parties, they wouldn't have one from 8 to 10. They would have one from the 8th through the 10th. So if you heard about a party, you ran, that's where they run, and they ran on trails to get to the party because of course it's a week-long party. They would get there in time. I don't know.
I actually think that's a great way to organize a city. Yeah.
Definitely.
Run to the party.
How long it takes you to get to the party. Yeah.
I'll ask. San Antonio has the people I've been working on trying to understand the how to build a house. They probably have a little bit to say about that, and all the early these places they have. The present day roads are really based on some trails, and they're very impossible in some cases.
Mm. But at least they take a clue, or they draw the movement from those ancient trails and don't just kind of lay a road grid on top of it.
Yeah,
topic.
we've looked at, we've looked at distances, relationships and distances. We're just still, working on that because we wanted to we now have enough. Well, I mean, 18 square kilometers is pretty good, but I want to finish those last two, where we'll have that area around. Oh, I know one of the things you asked was how might the way I interpret is how might the centers disrupt the settlement pattern, and that's something I'm very interested in because I know some of our house sites are not in good areas for, they look like they're lower and poorer land. So how does the existence of El Pilar modify what is sort of the general pattern? If everyone wants to be, and also the distance between houses, is that compromised in any way because they want to be closer to the center, or that presence is important? I can't.
But yeah, I was curious about that because in some cases it looks like the distance between the homes doesn't really change when you're closer to the center. It looks like there's an even distribution. And I was also curious if that has something to do with how they're using the landscape immediately around the houses. Like, was there a kind of given radius that every house mound or every compound knew that they needed X amount of land to cultivate something for themselves, for the household, and that just basically created an evenness of distribution as you move out?
Well, that's certainly, we have made the assumption that the patterns that we see at the time of contact and today, even though they're constrained, like the pictures I'm showing you are constrained by modern lot size. I can show you where they're doing the same thing. The insides are going through the milpa cycle right in their home. So yes, there's a home garden at and that's going to constrain, but how much? I mean, how much? I can't tell you, but we assume a number like 12. I think 12 meters, 10 or 12 meters. That would be part of the compound. So these units that I talk about, if they're outside of that, I consider them a separate unit, and then I have to decide, are they a solitary primary? Are they primary or secondary in that case? And I think there is. I mean, there's certainly a lot of room, and definitely, I have to say that I think those home gardens were a factor. And in the area where I work, there are no walls. It's not like the northern Yucatan. There's so much stone in the northern Yucatan that in prehistory they make walls. And in history, in fact, they have such a system or such a cultural dedication to walls that when they get split up now, because of course kids are going to get things, they have to go buy stone to make stone walls. I was saying, what is going on here? Because those were simply removing the stone. That's why they had the stone. But we don't have that same issue around El Pilar. So you can use yucca. I mean, I wonder what natural fences there might have been in that sort of the other side, not just they had home gardens. They had these forest gardens in their home, but also what was the tension? How did you know when you were not in your home anymore?
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you following.
Absolutely.
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Ford. It was really, your work has been inspiring. The relationships that you're uncovering between culture and the environment, I think, are critical to our understanding about how to be better stewards of a smaller, a planet with more people and no more space. Yeah,
that's what we really want. We want to have that impact. We just gave a Master Forest Gardener the Chancellor's Medal here last month. And that's the equivalent. The UC does not give honorary degrees. It's the equivalent of an honorary degree. And Narciso Torres has worked with me for 40 years. And I really felt we needed to honor him. And it's just that very thing, that they're doing things on the landscape that are going to be resilient, sustainable, and have been sustainable.
These are models. These are models that we need to understand more about how they can be productive to us in our future, our shared future. So yeah, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you for
thank you.
It's really neat to think that architecture, that somehow I could touch you guys too. That's neat.
Absolutely. And we hope to stay in touch.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you to everyone who came.